Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com and I'm here today with a model showcase video / new product announcement video for the 1/6 scale M27 recoilless rifle with the short tail trailer. Now the model that you see here is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and or purchase. However, like I often mention in these videos, I take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35 scale all the way up to 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, this would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@EastCoastArmory.com. Now, like I said earlier, this is a new product announcement video, and this model here is actually a new release 3D printed kit from EastCoastArmory.com. In this video, I'm going to go over the kit contents, as well as also go over the various features and details that are supplied with this kit. So stay tuned, there's going to be a lot of really cool info coming. Now before we go further with the video, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around the model. And this model here is the M27 105mm recoilless rifle mounted on the M22 Modified short tail trailer. Now for anyone who's a fan of the ECA channel, you'll notice that this is not the first time I've done a video on this type of a model. About a year or so ago, I went ahead and did my first rendition of the M27, only that one, the M22, was the long tail trailer. Now the most notable difference between the two units is with the length of the trail. On the M22 carriage, the front section has provisions for mounting on and clipping on the trail section. Now the trail section on the M22 trailer is utilized for 3 jobs. The first application is for towing. This is the section which would connect the M22 trailer to some kind of a tow vehicle, be it a Jeep or a truck. The second application is for the travel lock of the M27 itself. There's generally a clamp mechanism found on this section here, and this is where the barrel would clamp onto the unit, making it solid and preventing it from getting any sort of damage from transport. The third application for the trail is for the emplacement. There is generally a spade of some sort found on these items over here, and this would allow the unit to dig into the ground, preventing it from moving around during firing. Now, just like I said in the other M27 video, towards the latter half of World War II, the US Army were looking at developing a new generation of anti-tank weapons. With this period of the war, the Germans were developing and were fielding larger, heavier tanks, and also vehicles that had some very good armor protection. And the previous generation of anti-armor weaponry were not going to be able to penetrate and knock out one of these vehicles if encountered. One of the problems which was encountered by the engineers is that when you're designing an artillery piece to penetrate thicker pieces of armor, this will require both the velocity of the projectile to be increased as well as the caliber. When this happens, the artillery piece becomes heavier and bulkier, which makes it less mobile. The way these systems work is with the rear venturi design. Unlike a locked breech artillery piece where the unit must contain the entire explosion of the propellant in order to propel the round down the barrel, with a recoilless system, most of the propellant gases are vented towards the rear of the unit and vent off into the atmosphere. Very similar along the lines of a shoulder-fired bazooka. Several countries during the 1920s and even during the World War I timeframe were experimenting with this type of a system, but the system really lay dormant up until the end of World War II. The US military specifically took this concept and ran with it, utilizing the 57mm recoilless rifle as well as the 75mm version towards the very end of the war. Even though the 57mm and the 75mm units were being adopted and being fielded by the troops, the US military decided to scale up the recoilless rifle concept even more to a larger caliber, being a 105. With the 105mm chambering, this new weapon system should be able to deal with the newer German and Russian tanks which were being fielded and developed during this period of time. However, as soon as there was a firing prototype which was ready for production, the war ended. With the close of the war, all interest in new weapon technology basically dried up, and the 105 recoilless rifle fell by the wayside. Interest, however, was rejuvenated in the 1950s with the war in Korea, with the encountering of the Russian-made T-34s. The 105mm recoilless was dusted off and entered into production, as this unit here would be more than adequate with dealing with these threats. However, even though the M27s were adopted and entered into full production during this time, my resources are a little hazy on whether or not they saw service during the Korean conflict. However, what is known is that the M27 went through extensive research and development into the 1950s, with the M27 being utilized in several different roles. You had the towed artillery variant, which is like this model that we have here, to even vehicle-mounted units, which could be mounted either in a Jeep or even an M29 Weasel. The M27 stayed in service throughout the 1950s and also into a good portion of the 1960s. The unit was eventually phased out and replaced with the 106mm M40 recoilless rifle system. Before we go any further with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to when this model was first started in order to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplies you with. And here's the model in its unassembled kit form. All of the components that went into building the model that you just saw are strewn out here on the table. Now, just like with the other ECA full kits that are found on the ECA catalog, this model here is comprised entirely of 3D printed materials. The only components that are not 3D printed would be the parts that are in rubber, like the rubber tires, and also some of the rubber eye cups for the optics. Outside of a few other bits of hardware, the remainder of the kit is comprised of 3D printed parts. Now, since this model here is just a different flavor of the M27, all of the same M27 components which were seen in the last video are basically recycled, with the exception of some components for the trailer. Of course, we'll be going over that in a moment. Another difference to point out is that since the last M27 build was done, I went ahead and improved some of the components further, and those are the versions which are found on the actual production kits. This model here, those actual production components are found on this table, and we'll again be going over these changes momentarily. Now, this component here is very similar to the one discussed in the last M27 build video. However, this was one of the components that I went ahead and made some improvements to since the last release. If you notice on this version here, we have our casting numbers, which are integrally printed to the main bottom base. And if I turn to the back, you'll also see the two smaller lock pins for the elevation setup, which will be more prominent once the unit's fully assembled. Other than those two noteworthy mentions, this piece here is basically left intact and still has the same level of detail fidelity found on the last rendition. If we can see, it has the handbrake cluster, which is all integrally printed as one piece. Not to mention the rotation gearbox and the other main M27 receiver mounts. On the bottom portion, we have the lugs and the mounts which connect the M27 and lock it onto either something like a Jeep, or in this case, the M22 or the T47 Modified trailer. Now again, just like I mentioned, this is something that really takes advantage of the 3D printing technology, as if I was making this model in the past with my older school tooling, each and every one of these parts would have to be a separate resin casting, which would then need to be hand-fitted by the builder and mounted to the place you see it here. All that complication is avoided since the piece is one integral printing. Moving along takes to the last of the main substantial printed components, which is the rear receiver section. This component here has received some changes and modifications from the first rendition release that I came up with. Some of the changes would include the geometry here of this cone section. On the first releases, the unit was slightly wider, and after photographing and studying a real M27 in person, I went ahead and made some slight alterations to the geometry to make it better representative of the real unit. Another place where it was tweaked was in the front section here of the band. You'll notice that there is a small little elevated section, which again is present on the real unit. Other than that, the detailing is exactly the same with the rear locking lug sections in the breech area and also the ventures. We have the hinge detailing, which is left unchanged, and more importantly, we can see here the Xposed trigger mechanism that is found on this section. Again, it's all one integral printing. Also found on the sides here are the cable mounts for the trigger mechanism, the main elevation pivot point, and of course the front tower for the elevation hookup and also the indirect fire mode optic mount. Again, everything is one integral printing. From there brings us to this component that we have here. This is one of the new additions to the set and is what differs the T47 Modified from the M22. It still locks into the section in the same way. Now, unlike the M22 long trail where this entire unit was one very long piece of interconnected tubes, on the T47 Modified, it's a lot shorter in profile. As you can see, it also has 2 hinge points and 2 lock points here on the bottom for the use of the pivoting section, which I'll go over in a second. The rear section here of the short trail trailer. Here you can see how the piece is radically different compared to the M22's long trail design that I did in the last video. Now, one of the features that makes this piece unique is the way that it can stow in the retracted state for transport and lock in for firing mode. Just like with almost all artillery designs, it utilizes a spade shovel to prevent the unit from moving around when it's in place. Here we have 2 integral faux fasteners to be used as pins, which lock the unit to the back section that we have here, giving you the hinged operation. From here brings us to another component. Now this piece here is a new addition and it is specifically for the shortened T47 Modified trailer. What this is the main travel lock for the unit. Now, unlike the M22 where the travel lock for the gun was mounted at the rear section of the trailer, for this one, the travel lock is actually mounted on the middle section of the barrel. When in travel mode, this unit here will lock into this section and a pin will keep the barrel and the draw section locked in place. Now, for the detailing, the unit is designed to have the main PVC tube for the barrel cut, so you can add it, and this will give you the illusion that this piece is actually clamped onto the main barrel. In this much similar way as is done with the main trigger assembly. You can see the detailing found on the part. Notice the flange work with the fasteners seen. And the legs for the locking mechanism. The section is hollow printed through and through, so there's no obstruction in the barrel. If you look down through the muzzle end, you can see straight out through the breech. Now, this is one aspect of this version of the M27, which is very unique. Unlike the M22 trailer, where the long trail utilizes a lunette that's built into the rear section of the unit, on the T47 Modified, they went with a different approach. The approach they went with is this cluster type assembly, which has a clamp mechanism. The way this works is that you would insert this into the end of the barrel, and with this clamp mechanism, it would envelop the sides of the barrel, and once tightened on, prevents the unit from getting loose, and then you could just tow the entire unit with a Jeep or any sort of vehicle with a tow hitch. It's a very interesting concept, and I'll go over how it works once it's fully assembled. Because of this unit, there's also a separate runner of pins in order to properly connect everything together. And here's the model now fully completed and is ready for painting. However, before I go ahead and get it into paint and its final steps, I might as well take the camera around and show some of the features that the model has now that it's in this configuration. First thing to point out is the model's elevation. You can see that it's nice and responsive. And with those springs on the inside, it really prevents the barrel drooping due to the weight of all of the barrel amenities, as well as also the travel lock found on the end. Now, the same feature, of course, is mentioned on the other M27 kit that is produced by ECA. While on the travel lock, you can see how the unit mounts on. Now, just like with the real unit, there is a pin that would be chain retained on the completed unit, and this, of course, will be mounted once the model is completed. However, you can see how the unit still functions. There's a small little wing nut on the top here. You move that out of the way, and the whole travel lock clamshell's open and gets out of the way, so now the barrel is free of any sort of obstructions. Moving down from the elevation takes us to the actual mount that secures the M27 to the trailer base. And just like with the other ECA set, this is done without any sort of glues or adhesives whatsoever. These two latches here are what mount the base to the trailer. And the unit is fully functional in that if you want to remove the M27 for whatever reason, you simply just pop these two latches, and the entire M27 just pivots and unlocks out of the way. Here you can see the trailer, now with the M27 fully removed. The only difference between the ECA one and the real one is that on the real one, these springs over here would return these latches in the closed position. However, for the kit, that's really not necessary. But if it's something that you would like to incorporate on your build, that is doable. You just have to add some adhesives to the middle sections here, as the whole unit is really all plugged together. And if you glue it as one set, you will be able to have the springs actually return the units in place. Now, like I said before, the trailer is all pinned together, and no adhesives are used for the other assemblies as well. Starting with the wheels. To remove the wheels, just like on the real unit, there are these two tabs that you pull out. Once the tabs are removed, the entire wheel assembly, just on hooks like we have here. And the unit is now wheelless. Just like with the wheels, the entire tail section is also removable, again via the pin method. Pull these two retention pins, and the entire tail section slides directly off of the model. Now, here's the model now broken down into its main basic shapes. Now, this type of assembly does lead to several advantages. First and foremost is detail and functionality. Of course, it's very similar to the real one. Another advantage that this has is for the end user to get everything into paint. Because everything breaks down to sub-assemblies, it makes painting of everything a lot more easily done compared to having everything assembled as one complete unit. Now, the gun and the base assembly will be disassembled further from the way you see it here. Of course, with the barrel section and the base being two separate colors, this has to be done with the barrel assembly off of the main base. Now, this is, of course, held on with two little pins that we have on either side of the elevation unit. Once these pins get removed, the entire barrel and elevation cluster just disassemble, which allows it to be painted in a much more straightforward and efficient manner. Also to be taken down further will be the breech lock section, along with the lever, and some of the other optical equipment needs to be painted separately off of the main barrel assembly. Also, one final thing, you can see how smooth the unit does rotate, and you can see how the fastener is mounted on the inside portion of the bottom base. This simply just gets threaded on with a little bit of Loctite, and once the piece is mounted on, you don't need to take it off ever again. And here's the model now fully completed. Let me go ahead and bring the camera in closer so you get to appreciate the detailing now that it's in its completed state. Now that the camera's in closer, you can see the detailing of the elevation system in better focus. On the real unit, we have here a elevation crank wheel, the elevation columns, and a connecting drive shaft. Of course, on the real unit, by rotating this either left or right, this will either raise or depress the M27. Now, if you notice on these two sections here, which are painted to mirror the exposed bare metal sections of the elevation tube canisters, you'll notice that they're in brass coloring. This is something that I took directly off of the real M27 that I had an opportunity to photograph in detail. Moving from the Zerk fittings now takes us to the retention chains. Now on the real unit, the elevation towers are held in place via lock pins. These lock pins are mirrored on the model and are actually what's used to keep everything in its proper place. They are not glued in whatsoever, and if I go ahead and pull on this pin here, you'll see that it comes straight out. Now on the real unit, this is done for maintenance reasons, and they designed the pin so that you can't lose it and it's close nearby, and that is facilitated with this chain that we have here. The chain connects from the pin to one of these two integral rings that are found on the base here of the M27. Now, of course, all of these ring detailing are integrally printed to the unit, which was showcased before. The chains, however, obviously are real metal chains, and these are supplied with the kit. Now, while on this section here of the model, you can see the data plate. Now, the data plate is supplied with this kit, and it is, of course, 3D printed with the HD material. With going with this route, you can see that all of the information that's found on the data plate is clearly legible and is represented. This is one of those features which would have been difficult, if not impossible, to do with traditional medium, but with the new technologies, it's something that is going to be found on a lot more kits to be coming out. Now, if you notice on the M27 here, the data plate is actually made of brass as opposed to aluminum, which is seen on the weapon systems that came later, like the M40, for instance. Now, from the chain work brings us to the rotation equipment. Here you can see the unit now fully assembled. Now, like what was showcased before, the only thing that really needs to be added to this section here to complete it is the installation of the crank wheel, as well as the Zerk fittings, which are found over here, and there's another one found right up here on the brake bar. You can also see with the design of the M27 that all of the gun's functions are really done in this section over here. A gunner would sit around this corner and he would have access to either elevate or lower the gun, as well as even crank it either left or right. It is also why the gunner's at this position over here, which is why the trigger mechanism and direct fire optic are mounted on this section of the unit. Moving back further brings us to the rear mounting assembly, and this is for the rear section here of the receiver. All of the detailing is found on the clamping mechanism. And of course, there is again a small Zerk fitting here found on the top. Now, on the real unit, the way this works is that this is a hinged clamp, and this wing nut here is tightened in place and keeps everything where it needs to be. What's also unique is that the wing nut is self-contained, where you loosen it and it stops at this point over here, and it's not those type of wing nuts that can actually be fully removed. Moving up brings us to the breech or the venturi area. Now, just like with the ECA M40 and the other M27, this unit here is fully functional, where the breech mechanism hinges open. Now, it is very fragile, but it is fully functional. In addition to that, the lever is also designed to be functional as well, so you can display the unit either with the breech open state like I have here, or with the closed condition like what was seen before. Also, with the breech open, you could see the firing pin detailing found on this section here. Now, from the breech mechanism, this brings us to one of the more unique and one of my personal favorite attributes found on the M27 system, and that's the Xposed firing cable linkage system. Now, like I said before, the gunner station is towards the side of the M27, and in order to fire it, that was utilizing this little cluster that we have here. There is a little handle, and this handle is connected with a clevis and a cable to the rear firing mechanism. Now, to fire the gun, the gunner would simply grab onto this handle and give it a twist, and this twist would pull on this linkage, on this little yoke that we have back here, and that would actuate the sear for the firing pin. Now this cable firing system was also utilized on the M40 Recoilless, but that system was more refined compared to the external linkage type array that we have here. Now on the model, the unit is consisting of the cable, the clevises, and also these little guide mounts that we have here. Now the guide mounts are integrally printed to the main receiver base and are already pre-hollowed and drilled out by the printer. Because of this, you don't have to drill these sections out with a Dremel or anything in order to fit the cable into its correct location. The small little clevises are also printed in HD material, giving you very nice crisp detail fidelity. And also what's even more interesting is that the internal firing mechanism found inside this section over here is also integrally printed, and no assembly needs to be done further outside of connecting the clevis to the sear mechanism. Same thing can also be said to the front trigger handle here in the front. While on the front trigger mechanism, the housing itself, again, serves two functions. First, it houses the trigger mechanism for the linkage, but it also mounts the optic for the direct fire mode. Now, the optic is another 3D printed component, and what's unique about the ECA set is that the eye cups and the sun guard here are actually made of real cast rubber. Now on the opposite side, you can see some more detailing found on this part here. And what's very interesting about this mechanism is that you can adjust the height and the pitch of this optical mount. And that's facilitated with this knob that we have over here. By loosening or tightening this knob, we'll pitch and pivot this little section. All the detailing that I just described is integrally supplied with the ECA kit. Now also, while in this section here, you can see how the front tower assembly would mount to the barrel, where it's actually held on via straps and a type of flange type assembly, where we have two fasteners that clamp down onto the barrel and prevent it from moving around. Now, if we recall from the unboxing section, this entire unit is one integral printing, and the PVC barrel section simply plugged to it. Once everything is painted and weathered, the piece looks indistinguishable from the rest of the barrel assembly and gives the illusion that this bit of equipment here is actually clamped onto the barrel assembly as opposed to being three separate pieces. Moving back towards the receiver area takes to the top portion of the elevation tower. Now, just like with the bottom portions that were mentioned before, there is a lock pin which is used to connect the receiver to the elevation tower. Unlike the other two columns though, which each utilize a pin, for this section here, only one pin is required for this job. Just like with the other pins, however, there is a little retention chain just to prevent the pin from getting lost. Also, just like with the other portion, there is an internal ring that's found on the top portion here for this exact purpose. And here you can see on the reverse side the detail illusion of the flange mechanisms, and this is a mirror image on the opposite side. And from there, this brings us to the secondary optic. Now, like I said in the other M27 video, what's unique about the M27 system is that on one complete unit, you have the ability to use this weapon for either direct fire or indirect fire purposes. The direct fire scope was mentioned before over the trigger housing, but the indirect fire was mounted more towards the rear of the unit. Here you can see the optic which would be utilized for that system. Now, the optic itself is a 3D printed component and is offered separately on the EastCoastArmory.com product line in case anyone has a 1/6 scale bit of an artillery or a M10 of sorts and you want to add this detailing to your unit. The model is very nicely detailed. In fact, it is really just a miniature scale model in its own right. Just like with the other scope, this utilizes a cast rubber eye cup, which is, of course, nice and flexible. And the unit, just like the other optic before, is printed in a HD material. Because of this material, the whole unit itself is very translucent in its coloring, and because of that, this makes it a fantastic choice for optics because you don't have to paint the lens sections on both the top or the bottom. With this material, you just paint around it and you get a very realistic appearance with the optics. In addition to the lenses being clear, you'll also see the bubble levels both on the side here and on the back. The detailing is also present on this piece, and being again in clear, or I should say translucent material, makes for these units being left exposed to be very nicely detailed, and it's just something that really comes out towards the viewer. Furthermore, you'll see all the dials and knobs, all their detailing is supplied. Even the little tech data plate is found integrally printed to the side. Now the optic itself connects to this optic mount, which is a basic standard USGI artillery optic mount, and that would connect then to this section here of the M27. You can see that with this little anvil-shaped assembly found on the receiver, it facilitates both the optic mount and also the mount for the elevation tower. And to make things even more interesting, just like with the other optic assembly found on the front, the rear was also adjustable again with some pitch adjustability to it. And that's facilitated with this knob that we have over here. By tightening or loosening this knob, this will interact with this surface and the whole unit will pivot in this type of a motion. Now moving forward along the gun barrel takes us to the travel lock clamp. Now this was the one bit of equipment, like I said before, which separates this version of the M27 compared to the long trail counterpart. Like I said before, on the real unit this would be a flange type assembly, which would strap to the main barrel via these fasteners. Again, just like with the other section, this is designed to be a plug type assembly, and once everything is fully painted and weathered, gives the illusion of the flange type appearance to it. And moving along to the end of the barrel brings us to the more unique and most iconic bit of detailing for this version of the M27, and that's the front clamp-on lunette system. Now, like I said before, with the long tail version of the trailer, the lunette is integrally found mounted on the rear section along with the gun's travel lock. With this unit here being much smaller in size, the designers had to be a little bit more creative with the way the unit needs to be transported, and they developed this system that we have here. Now, this type of a clamp-on lunette system is somewhat unique. Several other artillery pieces have done something similar along the lines, but generally whenever you see a front-mounted lunette, it's usually integrally found on the muzzle brake, like on the M777 for instance. That design comes to mind. On this section over here, it will just clamp on. Now, one thing that's interesting about this type of design and can be a hurdle is with this type of a layout, there's the opportunity of damage being made to the rifling found on the inside portion here. The reason why I say that is that the lunette isn't just found on the face, but actually is spring bound on the real unit. If I take off this barrel clamp mechanism, we'll see it more in detail. Now, like I was showcased before, there is a small wing nut which keeps the top portion in place, and on the bottom portion we have here a lock pin which is chain retained. If you like modeling chain on your models, this model here is definitely going to be something up your alley because there is a whole load of it. Let me go ahead and pull the lock pin. That falls down. This piece flowers open and pulls out. Here you can see the unit, how fully opened up. And here's the lunette and the lunette tube. Like I said before, there would be a spring or possibly a hydraulic type system on the inside, and this gives you a little bit of some shock absorbing capabilities found on this section over here. Now, what's cool about this unit is that it has this big foot to it, and that is so when you take the lunette off of the towing vehicle, the entire front portion is going to want to go downward and make contact with the floor. By adding this foot here, this protects both the lunette and also the barrel mechanism of the unit. This will be more visible once I convert the system into its travel lock mode. Now, from the barrel brings us to the T47 Modified trailer, and here we have the bottom section. Like I said before, this is where the spade of the unit is, and you can see that there's, like I said before, a whole bunch of chain supplied with this model. On the top portion here, we have the top lock pin, and this would be for connecting the travel lock yoke that's found on the center portion of the barrel to the retracting spade. However, before I can do that, I need to unpin these two lock pins that we have over here. Let me bring the camera around and show that more. Okay, with the camera over here, you can see how this is done. Now, these pins here are, again, chain retained. So if I pull the retention chains, I can now pull out the pins. And at this point here, the entire unit can hinge upward, like so. With the lunette now mounted to the barrel, I can drop the barrel down into its lock position like we have here. Once the holes line up, you can then take the pin, slide it directly in place, and from here, the unit is now in its transport mode. As for these little pins here, these guys will be reconnected to their locations, and their securing pins will then be added. On the real unit, this would of course prevent these pins from getting lost. And here's the unit now in its travel mode, and you can see exactly why I said before that bottom foot was important. Like I said, it protects both the lunette as well as the bottom portion of the barrel from getting damaged. At this point here, you could just hitch this up to some vehicle of your choice and cart the entire unit away. And here's the unit in its travel mode, fully hitched up and mounted to a Jeep. Now the Jeep itself is the Dragon 1/6 scale plastic Jeep kit. Of course, I have more information about this model in another model showcase video, but basically the unit will work with any 1/6 scale Jeep model that's on the market, with the caveat that you modify the tow hitch. This model here does feature a EastCoastArmory.com functional rest and tow hitch. Now this unit is an older build, and the rest and tow hitch that's found on this model here is no longer in production and is OOP. The unit that replaced this model here was the fully 3D printed counterpart, which is found on the EastCoastArmory.com catalog. In addition to having the tow hitch for the World War II pattern Jeep, I also have the tow hitch for the M151 Mutt series of vehicles as well. The replacement tow hitches will work on any 1/6 scale model Jeep on the market, from the Dragon model like we have here, to the SOTW, 21st Century Toys, as well as the Hasbro rendition as well. And while I have the model out, I might as well compare and contrast it with the other M27 kit rendition, which is listed on the EastCoastArmory.com catalog. On the left-hand side, we have the unit that was showcased in this video, and on the right-hand side, we have the M27 with the long-tail M22 trailer. And here you can immediately see the difference between the two patterns of unit. Obviously, as the name implies, the long-tail trailer has a continuous structure that mounts to the M22 wheeled section, which gives you the spade as well as a integral travel lock along with the lunette. On the short trail counterpart, you can see that the design was changed into a much more consolidated type design. Now, because of the travel lock being on the end, that's what necessitated the use of this really long system that we have here. On the short trail counterpart, the travel lock was moved towards the center of the barrel via this clamp, which really cut down the length of the unit. Now, for the lunette and the towing, of course, that's done with this cluster that I mentioned before, which clamps onto the barrel. Now, as for which design is better, well, really, they both have their pros and cons. The unit that we have here is much more simpler in that the gun itself has absolutely no modifications made to it. However, with the long section that we have here, it does make the unit a lot more cumbersome compared to the lower profile short trail counterpart. But with this system here, you have an extra unit clamped onto the barrel, and then there's also the risk of the rifling getting damaged from the lunette that needs to be mounted towards the barrel section. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe that the sleeve here can possibly cause accuracy issues, but this is something that's really more of a hunch and not something that I've seen actually documented. Another thing to point out is that because of the shorter design, this pattern here is also more complicated compared to the longer pattern. Because of the shorter design, the unit needs to hinge upward and has to have these locking mechanisms found on the frame itself, as opposed to the long trail where that's just not the case. Also, another feature that the long trail has that the short trail doesn't is that because of the long boom that we have here, there are mounts and provisions found on this section for cleaning staves, which are used to clean the gun. With the short trail pattern, the staves mounts are obviously not present, and so they are not part of this system and would probably have to be carried either in the transport vehicle or by some other means. Now, another accessory that's offered on the EastCoastArmory.com catalog are the actual ammunition that's used on this set. These are the same rounds that were mentioned in the 1/6 scale M40 video that was posted a little while ago. These rounds, even though are patterned off of the ones for the M40, are almost identical to the ones used on the M27. We have the empty spent casing, as well as the loaded counterpart. The loaded round replicates that of the armor-piercing projectile, which is perfect in case you want to punch some holes into some Russian tanks. Both patterns of rounds are made from the same 3D printed material. And with that, that wraps up this model showcase video / new product announcement video for the EastCoastArmory.com 1/6 scale M27 recoilless rifle with the M22 short tail trailer. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, from new product announcement videos like this guy here, to small and larger scale model showcase videos, all the way up to 1/6 scale project update videos when they get posted. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There I have more photographs of these two particular models here, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been posted on the ECA channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by EastCoastArmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds, detail components, and full 3D printed kits. Thanks for watching.